In this lesson, we are solving quadratic equations by using square roots. The biggest thing to remember is that you need to make sure to get the x squared by itself, which we call isolating the variable. So in our first problem, we want to get the x squared alone. So what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 23 from both sides. So we have 2x squared is equal to negative 18. And then we're going to divide both sides by 2. So we have x squared is equal to negative 9. And once we have isolated the variable, then we want to take the square root of both sides, because remember, a square root and a square are opposite operations and they cancel each other. And because we are solving an equation, we don't know if we want the positive or negative answer, so we always remember to put our plus or minus. The square root of 9 is 3. And the square root of a negative 1 is I. So that solution will be x equals plus or minus 3i. In our next example, we want to get the square by itself, and even though it's a quantity, it's the exact same procedure. So we have subtracting 8 from both sides. And then we're going to divide both sides by 2. So we have x minus 3, the quantity squared, is equal to negative 4. And now that we have the square by itself, we want to take the square root of both sides, because remember that those are opposite operations. So a square and a square root cancel. So we have x minus 3 equals, don't forget your plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of a negative 1 is I. To finish, we're going to add 3 to both sides. And when we do that, remember that the real number part is first, which is the 3, and then we put the imaginary part second, which is our plus or minus 2i. In our next example, we want to get the x squared by itself, so we're going to subtract 17 from both sides. So we have negative 4x squared is equal to negative 36. We're going to divide both sides by negative 4. So we have x squared is equal to a positive 9. And now we're going to take the square root of both sides, since we have the x squared by itself. So we have x is equal to plus or minus 3, which is the square root of 9. And please remember now, since it's not a negative 9, that we don't need the I. In our next example, we're going to add 21 to both sides. So we have 3x minus 2, the quantity squared, is equal to 21. Divide both sides by 3. So we have x minus 2, the quantity squared, is equal to 7. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. A square and a square root are opposite operations. So we have x minus 2 equals. Since the square root of 7 is not a perfect square, we're going to leave it as a radical. But don't forget your plus or minus, and since it can't be simplified, we'll leave it as the square root of 7. To finish, we're going to add 2 to both sides. X is equal to, remember to write the real part first, which is the 2. Then we're going to put the radical second, the plus or minus square root of 7, which is also a real number, but we'll put the radical as the second part. All right, in our last example, the first thing we're going to do is multiply both sides by negative 2, which is the opposite of, or the inverse of negative 1/2. Negative times a negative is a positive, and 2 times 1/2 would be 1. So we have x plus 5, the quantity squared, equals negative 16. Now we have the square by itself, so we're going to take the square root of both sides. A square and a square root cancel. So we have x plus 5 is equal to, remember we put our plus or minus, the square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of negative 1 would be I. To finish, we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. So we have x is equal to negative 5 plus or minus 4i. Please try the remaining problems and then submit.